Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a period that is so uh, fraught with political tension and just spiritual chaos that it literally saw an entire nation erased from the map.
Yeah.
And if you think of ancient history as slow and predictable, forget it. The final decades of the Kingdom of Judah were defined by blinding speed, shifting alliances, and, well, utter catastrophe. So this is our deep dive into that collapse, and our guide is the most anguished, yet, ultimately hopeful voice of that era, the prophet Jeremiah.
What's so fascinating here is that the sources you've shared give us so much more than a dry chronological account of kings and invasions and sieges.
Right.
They provide the complete blueprint, the rationale behind the disaster. The material meticulously documents a spiritual and political failure so complete that it made the Babylonian exile just inevitable.
So we're really getting the why, not just the what.
Exactly. We're looking at prophecies delivered over 23 turbulent years, starting around 627 BC, that link this huge national tragedy directly to covenant disobedience.
And crucially, the story doesn't end with the destruction of Jerusalem. That sense of total loss, it actually sets the stage for some of the most powerful, enduring messages of hope. It's the seed of a promised restoration.
It is.
So our mission today is to really extract the core insights. First, we need to trace that dizzying political and military descent through the reigns of those four final doomed kings.
And second, we have to dissect the spiritual charges. I mean, the shocking hypocrisy, the widespread idolatry, and just the sheer obstinance that defied any kind of correction.
And finally, we have to grasp those powerful, non-negotiable messages of restoration, especially this concept of the new covenant. It's a challenging story, isn't it?
It's a very challenging dual narrative. You're facing the absolute certainty of judgment, but at the same time, the absolute certainty that the prophetic word of Yahweh remained faithful and would, in the end, secure the nation's future.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the timeline of Judah's final years, it's kicked off by this massive, unanticipated tragedy. And the consequences just instantly destabilize the entire region. I'm talking about the death of King Josiah.
Josiah was a real high point in Judah's history, a true reformer. He's known for cleaning up the temple, destroying pagan shrines, reinstituting the Passover.
He was trying to turn the ship around.
He was trying to reverse decades of national decline. But then in 609 BC, at just 39, he misjudges the global political landscape. The dominant power, Assyria, was collapsing. It was just crumbling under the weight of the rising Babylonian Empire.
Okay.
So Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt decides to march north to help the Assyrians. He's hoping to maintain a stable buffer state and stop Babylon's westward expansion.
And Josiah decides to intercept him at Megiddo. Why would he do that? I mean, why would Josiah, a spiritual reformer, insert himself into a conflict that didn't immediately threaten Judah?
Well, it was a very risky geopolitical gamble. Josiah likely saw this as an opportunity to weaken both Egypt and Assyria. He was hoping to secure full independence for Judah by playing the powers against each other, maybe even reuniting the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah.
But he failed.
He failed, and his death in that battle was devastating. It wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was the collapse of the only stabilizing force in the nation, and it immediately gave Pharaoh Necho control over Judah.
And instantly, Judah becomes little more than a pawn in this great game between Egypt and the soon-to-be global superpower, Babylon.
Yes.
This volatility begins right away with Josiah's second son, Jehoahaz. He's also known as Shallum. And the sources say he ruled for only 3 months in 609 BC.
He was popular with the Judean people, which is probably why they installed him, but he wasn't compliant enough for the new regional master, Pharaoh Necho.
So Necho just got rid of him.
The moment Necho returned from the north, he deposed Jehoahaz. He imposed a massive tribute on Judah and deported the young king to Egypt as a prisoner, where he later died in captivity.
Whoa.
This established the new pattern for Judah. Foreign powers were now dictating who sat on the throne, regardless of what the local people wanted. It showed the world that Judah was no longer sovereign.
The power structure in the Near East was then, fundamentally and violently reshaped just a few years after this in 605 BC.
Yes. This is the pivotal moment. Prince Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon achieves this decisive, crushing defeat of the allied Egyptian and Assyrian forces at Carchemish.
So this is it, the big one.
This victory didn't just win a battle, it ended the Assyrian Empire and signaled to the world that Babylon was the new, non-negotiable global hegemon. Suddenly, Egypt wasn't the primary geopolitical factor for Judah anymore.
It was Babylon.
It was Babylon, and they were approaching fast.
This brings us to the next puppet king,
Yeah.
Jehoiakim. He was Shallum's older brother, and he reigned for 11 years, from 609 to 598 BC, and he was placed on the throne by Pharaoh Necho after his brother was deported.
The sources characterized Jehoiakim as completely untrustworthy. He's constantly shifting allegiance between Egypt and Babylon, trying to play both sides for his own perceived advantage. It just shows profound political instability.
And it was more than just bad politics.
Oh, much more. For Jeremiah's message, he was a morally corrupt and unjust ruler, the complete opposite of his father Josiah. He violated covenant law by using unpaid forced labor to build his lavish new palace.
And this is where Jeremiah's confrontation with the political powers really escalates. It moves beyond simple prophecy into direct conflict. Jehoiakim utterly refused the prophet's counsel, which was pretty simple.
It was. Submit to Babylon, resistance is futile.
His act of defiance against Jeremiah, I think, just perfectly encapsulated his entire reign.
It really did. Jeremiah had dictated all his prophecies, all the warnings, the charges, the judgments, onto a scroll written by his scribe Baruch. Jehoiakim, sitting by the fire in his winter palace, showed his utter contempt by cutting the scroll with a scribe's knife and throwing it piece by piece into the fire.
He literally burned the message.
He did. It was a physical act of rejecting the divine word itself. He believed he could nullify God's message simply by destroying the document.
That arrogance had immediate consequences.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar, who is now king, he invades Palestine, conquers cities, and takes nobles in the first deportation in 605 BC. And this group included Daniel.
Right.
Jehoiakim managed to hold on for a few more years, but then he rebelled in 601 BC, was deposed, and died. An ignominious death.
Indeed. Jeremiah had predicted the fate of this wicked king. He said he would be given the burial of a donkey, dragged out of the city, and left unburied just like a dead donkey.
It was the ultimate statement on his wickedness and failure. A leader so universally despised and irrelevant that he didn't even merit proper religious rites. He didn't even get a grave.
No grave.
Next up, we have Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, also known as Jeconiah or Coniah. He ruled for just 3 months.
3 months, from 598 to 597 BC. The sources make it clear he was also evil, and Jeremiah predicted that the Lord would essentially cut off his royal line, proclaiming that none of his descendants would ever rule on the throne of David.
And during those 3 brief months, Nebuchadnezzar came back.
He returned to Jerusalem to put down the rebellion Jehoiakim had started, and this led to the second major deportation in 597 BC. This was a really strategic political move. Nebuchadnezzar removed Jehoiachin, the queen mother, officials, leaders, craftsmen, metalworkers.
The entire national infrastructure.
Pretty much. The sources say that 10,000 citizens were exiled in this sweep.
What's the significance of taking the craftsmen and the metalworkers? That seems very specific.
It was brilliant military and political strategy. It simultaneously neutered Judah's ability to wage war. I mean, there's no one left to forge weapons or build siege engines.
Right.
And it enriched Babylon by providing skilled labor for their own monumental building projects.
Yeah.
But from the prophetic perspective, this group of exiles became incredibly important. Jeremiah later called them the good figs.
The good figs.
Yes, suggesting that despite being displaced, the future of the covenant people lay with these exiles in Babylon, not with the remnant that was left behind in Judah.
The final king was Zedekiah, Josiah's third son, who ruled from 597 to 586 BC. He was installed as a puppet ruler by Nebuchadnezzar, forced to swear allegiance to Babylon.
And the sources portray him as a truly tragic figure. He was weak, indecisive. They depict him as someone who feared his own nationalist nobles far more than he feared the Lord or the approaching Babylonian might.
His reign was just one long, agonizing countdown to destruction.
It was. Under immense pressure from the nationalist faction, those who believed God would miraculously save the city. Zedekiah broke his oath to Nebuchadnezzar. He allied with Pharaoh Hophar of Egypt in 589 BC.
And that was the last straw.
That act of covenant violation and political rebellion led directly to the final Babylonian siege in 588 BC.
So how extensive was that final siege? What was life like inside Jerusalem?
It was horrific and protracted. The Babylonians were masters of siege warfare. They built earthworks, blockades around the city, and they systematically starved the population.
Wow.
The sources detailed the desperation, widespread famine, disease, and eventually even cannibalism among the poorest citizens. For over 2 years, the city endured this slow death, punctuated by moments of false hope.
like when the Egyptian army showed up.
Exactly. They briefly drew Nebuchadnezzar away, only to be quickly defeated, allowing the siege to resume with renewed vigor.
And the sources confirm the precise, agonizing fulfillment of Jeremiah's predictions for Zedekiah's fate when the wall was finally breached in 586 BC.
Yes, it's a devastating sequence of events. Zedekiah tried to escape with his soldiers through a hidden gate between the two walls, but he was captured in the plains of Jericho.
And they took him to Nebuchadnezzar.
They took him north to Riblah, Nebuchadnezzar's headquarters, and there he was forced to watch the slaying of his sons and his nobles.
I mean, you have to imagine the psychological torture of witnessing the utter destruction of your lineage and your nation's leadership.
And then came the ultimate calculated punishment. Following the executions, Nebuchadnezzar put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him in chains, leading him off to Babylon to die in captivity.
Fulfilling the prophecy.
It fulfilled Jeremiah's prophecy that the king would see Babylon, but not with his own eyes. The prophecy was absolute. The king who refused to submit to the yoke was forced to witness the death of his legacy before being plunged into permanent, inescapable darkness and exile. That moment, 586 BC, represents the definitive end of the kingdom of Judah.
That political and military collapse, which we just traced, it was really just the external, visible symptom of a far deeper internal spiritual disease. Jeremiah's message is fundamentally a legal case against Judah for profound spiritual malfeasance. It outlines exactly why God's judgment was necessary.
And the core charge is one of spiritual adultery, a complete rejection of the covenant relationship. Think about the fundamental relationship. Yahweh had delivered them out of Egypt, protected them, provided for them.
He asks them, "What fault did you find?"
Exactly. The Lord asks, what fault could they possibly have found in him that they strayed so far? And the answer was their willful choice to reject the only true source of provision and life.
And the metaphor the sources use for this rejection is incredibly powerful. It just highlights the sheer irrationality of their choice.
Absolutely. They rejected Yahweh, the fountain of life-giving water, the ultimate pure source of life and sustenance, for what Jeremiah called cracked cisterns that cannot even hold water.
Crashed cisterns.
Think about it. Cisterns require maintenance. They can crack. They often contain stagnant, dirty water. Their idols were the broken cisterns, worthless, empty, human-made substitutes that offered no help, no true sustenance. This was a double sin.
The sin of omission and commission.
The sin of omission, rejecting the faithful Lord, and the sin of commission, actively pursuing these worthless substitutes.
That imagery, it just drives home the point that they weren't just making a mistake, they were being utterly foolish and self-destructive. And the sources emphasize the sheer brazenness of it all.
Yes, the sources reflect the Hebrew concept of corporate solidarity, which means the sin was so pervasive it wasn't hidden away. Idolatry was practiced openly on every high hill and under every green tree.
It was just everywhere.
They were like a special vine, carefully planted from the very best stock that had suddenly gone wild, producing rotten, foul-smelling grapes. The sin was corporate. It affected children and grandchildren, showing that the parents' actions carried dire consequences for the destiny of the entire nation.
But the sources outline the absolute pinnacle of this corporate sin, an act so horrific that the Lord declared it was something he never commanded. Indeed, it never even entered my mind.
Child sacrifice.
Child sacrifice.
This is the most shocking detail we find in the sources. The abhorrent practice of sacrificing sons and daughters by fire to the god Molech. This practice was centered in the valley of Ben Hinnom, also called Topheth, just outside Jerusalem.
What does that say about the state of their society?
It speaks to the desperation and the moral rot of the people. They were trying to buy the favor of these false gods, offering their own children as the ultimate payment. It was essentially a spiritual transaction of pure terror and desperation.
And what was the prophetic consequence for choosing this horrific site for their wickedness?
The prophet pronounced an absolute judgment upon that location. The valley where parents tried to secure their own safety at their children's expense would be renamed the Valley of Slaughter.
Wow.
During the Babylonian siege, the corpses would be so numerous, victims of famine, disease, the sword, that the valley would become a mass grave for the Israelites because there would be no one left and no time to bury them. A place of heinous sin transformed into a place of horrific judgment.
Beyond the idolatry, there was this complete failure of leadership and morality that just infected the public square. The sources condemn the leaders, the priests, the rulers, the prophets.
For failing to know God, for failing to seek justice, and for living solely for material gain. They were, and this is a quote, skilled at doing evil, but completely inept at doing good.
The deceit wasn't accidental, it was a cultivated skill.
Exactly. The sources say that people train themselves to tell lies using their words like deadly arrows to assassinate reputations or commit fraud. This practice of persistent, habitual evil led to a profound moral blindness, particularly around social justice.
How so?
They used their affluence to pursue one evil thing after another. They wouldn't plead the cause of the fatherless to secure justice, nor would they defend the rights of the poor. Instead, they used fraud and oppression to enrich themselves. This is a classic prophetic critique. When you ignore the poor, you demonstrate you have ignored God.
And the ultimate hypocrisy was rooted in their religious rituals. They would commit these major sins, robbery, murder, adultery, and then just show up at the temple.
And seek safety there, essentially concluding that God had forgiven them so they could go out and sin again. They weaponized ritual, believing that participation in the formal cult would somehow deliver them from the consequence of their actions.
They had turned the temple into a false sanctuary.
A den of robbers. This is why Jeremiah issues that powerful, chilling warning of Shiloh. Shiloh was the site of the tabernacle and the ark centuries earlier, but God allowed the Philistines to destroy it utterly because the priests and the people were corrupt.
So the message was, don't think this building will save you.
Exactly. The presence of the magnificent temple offered absolutely no protection or safety for covenant breakers. The habitual sinner who ignores the law is never safe from judgment, no matter how grand their religious building is.
This emphasizes the deep contrast between external ritual and internal reality. They were relying on the external sign of the covenant, being circumcised only in the flesh.
But utterly lacked the necessary internal transformation the Lord required, the circumcision of the heart.
And that phrase, circumcision of the heart, is key to understanding this entire failure, isn't it?
It is. It's a metaphor for true spiritual dedication associated with loving God, obeying his law, and not being stubborn. The people had separated the physical symbol from the internal repentance and heartfelt commitment it was meant to represent.
So they turned it into a cultural thing.
They reduced the covenant to a physical, cultural ritual. The Lord promised to punish them, making them no better than the pagan nations around them who also practiced circumcision as a cultural ritual because neither group possessed true devotion to Yahweh. Their hearts remained spiritually unyielding.
And finally, the sources use Sabbath breaking as a kind of perfect litmus test for the nation's overall spirituality. Why was this one commandment so crucial?
Sabbath observance was the sign of the Mosaic covenant itself. It recognized Yahweh both as creator granting rest after 6 days of work and as redeemer remembering their rest from Egyptian slavery. Their refusal to keep the Sabbath demonstrated their obstinance and utter refusal to take correction.
They were just too busy.
They were so intent on commerce and their own pursuits that they refused the mandated spiritual rest. They confused what they called the ancient ways with obsolete ways, choosing instead to rely on human striving and economic scheming.
And the consequence for this specific rebellion was profoundly physical.
It was. Because they refused the rest God provided, the Lord promised that Jerusalem's fortified dwellings and palaces would be burned down, a fire no one would be able to put out. Repentance was the only thing that could postpone this judgment, but their habitual Sabbath breaking proved they were past the point of return.
The messenger of this judgment, Jeremiah, lived a life defined by intense suffering and profound symbolism. His ministry wasn't just preaching. His entire existence was a visual aid for God's judgment. He's famously known as the weeping prophet.
And his emotional life was inseparable from his ministry. He wasn't weeping because he was sad. He was weeping because he was looking into the future and seeing the sheer terror overtaking his people, crushed because they had passed up every single opportunity to repent.
He felt it physically.
He did. He compared his suffering to an incurable wound. He even cursed the day he was born because his faithful ministry produced only strife and contention among his own countrymen.
I think we sometimes forget how isolated true prophets were. Jeremiah didn't just disagree with the status quo. He was actively hated for what they saw as a lack of patriotism.
He was hated precisely because he was truly patriotic. He told them the truth that would save them, but they only wanted to hear lies that would justify their current course. He was so repulsed by his countrymen's spiritual adultery and treachery that at one point he longed for a simple place of retreat in the wilderness, just to escape the sheer wickedness of the city.
And the Lord imposed this powerful symbolic life upon him, essentially commanding him to live a life that mirrored the coming devastation.
Yes, the sources confirm the command not to marry or have children in that land. This wasn't merely a lifestyle choice. It was a visible, powerful sign of God's complete withdrawal of compassion from the nation.
So his personal life was a prophecy.
His unmarried status signified the end of the covenant relationship, and having no children symbolized the resulting destitution and the cessation of all joy, gladness, and celebration of brides and grooms in Judah. His very existence was a silent, constant prophecy of the horrors that were imminent and inevitable.
So, against the political machinations of Zedekiah's court, where everyone was scheming for an Egyptian alliance, Jeremiah delivered one clear, unwavering political message.
Submission to Babylon is God's explicit will.
That's it. Simple as that.
He counseled King Zedekiah and the envoys arriving from Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon to submit immediately to the yoke of servitude to King Nebuchadnezzar. And crucially, Yahweh calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant.
Which isn't a compliment.
Not at all. It's a statement of sovereign control, confirming that Babylon was merely the tool of divine judgment. Jeremiah physically wore a yoke of leather straps and wooden crossbars to visually emphasize the simplicity and severity of this warning. Take the yoke willingly, or it will be forced on you violently.
This must have been deeply offensive to the Jewish nationalists and their foreign allies.
It was pure treason in their eyes. But Jeremiah insisted resistance was futile and would result only in destruction by war, starvation, and disease. Submitting, conversely, would allow the nation to continue to live and farm in its native land, albeit under foreign rule.
So he was advising pragmatic survival rooted in theological obedience.
Yes, but it went directly against the nationalistic fervor that promised inevitable victory.
And the main source of strife was this constant battle against the false prophets. These were the establishment figures, men like Hananiah in Jerusalem, who assured the people, things will go well for you.
They promised peace, prosperity, and a quick return of the temple vessels that had been taken captive just a few years earlier.
So what's the essential difference here? How do you tell the true prophet from the false one?
It lay in their access to and concern for the divine plan. False prophets reported visions of their own imaginations. They filled people with false hopes and lacked access to the Lord's inner circle, the heavenly council, where God revealed his genuine plans.
They just said what people wanted to hear.
Exactly. A true prophet listens to God's counsel, proclaims his message regardless of popularity, and critically, their message is always designed to turn the people from their wicked course. The false prophets, concerned only with maintaining their own positions, did the opposite.
So this seems like a critical distinction for you, the listener.
Yeah.
How can someone tell the difference between a true and false message?
The sources offer two tests. First, the content. A true prophet's message usually involves a call to repentance and warns of judgment if the people refuse to change. A false prophet offers unconditional, easy comfort without demanding repentance.
And the second test.
Fulfillment. Jeremiah specifically stated that if a prophet promises peace and prosperity and that peace does not come to pass, then you know the Lord did not send him. In Judah's case, when Nebuchadnezzar returned to the walls of Jerusalem, the false prophets were definitively proven wrong.
And the Lord made sure the false prophets paid a price for their deception. We see two specific examples of this, even reaching into the exiled community in Babylon.
Yes, we see the judgment reaching them even there. Two false prophets, Ahab and Zedekiah, who had committed adultery and spoken lies in the Lord's name, were handed over to Nebuchadnezzar and roasted to death in the fire.
Wow.
Another, Shemaiah the Nehelamite, who had sent subversive letters to the exiles, was cursed to lose his family line and was prohibited from seeing the future good promised to the nation. This was the Lord's specific retribution because they had acted shamefully and, most damagingly, made the exiles trust in a lie that prolonged their despair.
Jeremiah's consistent message of surrender, however, it led to him being charged with treason and ultimately imprisoned. And the tragedy of the king, Zedekiah, it really comes to a head here. He desperately sought Jeremiah out secretly, asking if there was any message from the Lord, yet he was too weak to act on the truth.
Zedekiah was the ultimate tragic figure of indecision. He knew Jeremiah spoke the truth, yet he feared his own nobles more than the Lord.
Right.
When the officials angrily demanded Jeremiah be put to death for demoralizing the soldiers by urging surrender, Zedekiah essentially surrendered his moral and political authority. He said, "Very well, you can do what you want with him, for I cannot do anything to stop you."
He just gave up.
He preferred to remain popular with his inner circle of nationalist traitors rather than save his city by submitting to the divine will. That is the definition of faithlessness through weakness of character.
And the spinelessness led directly to that horrific cistern episode. The officials lowered Jeremiah into the cistern of Malchijah, a pear-shaped, bottlenecked pit that contained no water, only deep, suffocating mud.
They wanted him to die there by natural causes, starvation, exposure, or drowning in the mud, to avoid the official execution that might provoke a backlash. The pit was designed to store rainwater, but in dry times, it was essentially a death trap.
And Jeremiah sinking into that mud is profound political symbolism.
It is. Zedekiah, politically, militarily, and spiritually, was utterly stuck in the mud, incapable of changing his own mind or the nation's fate. Jeremiah promised him that if he courageously surrendered, he would live and the city would be spared.
But if he refused?
If he refused, fearing the Jewish fugitives who might mock him more than God, he would be captured and the city would burn. Zedekiah refused to submit, fearing human scorn more than divine judgment, and his fate was sealed by his inability to act with courage.
As the siege neared its catastrophic end in 586 BC, the sources present one final, devastating example of the nation's incurably bad heart. This is the incident of the Oathbreakers, and it ensured Jerusalem's fate was sealed.
This is a perfect illustration of crisis-induced, utterly insincere repentance. During the siege, Nebuchadnezzar temporarily withdrew his forces to confront Pharaoh Hophra's advancing Egyptian army. In this moment of respite, the people of Jerusalem, fearing God's imminent judgment, entered into a covenant to free all their Hebrew slaves.
Which was the right thing to do according to their law.
Right. Recognizing the Mosaic law requirement to free servants after 6 years of service, for a brief moment, they did what was pleasing to the Lord.
But that moment was fleeting. The sources record that as soon as the Babylonian army returned to recommence the siege, the people turned right around and showed that they did not honor me, forcibly taking back every single slave they had just freed.
This covenant violation wasn't just poor behavior. It was a profound, blatant act of moral blindness. It confirmed they were incorrigible covenant breakers. The Lord declared a horrifying, ironic consequence.
Well, love it.
Since they had not granted freedom to their neighbors, he would grant them freedom, the freedom to die by the sword, pestilence, and famine. This breach guaranteed their destruction, and we see this judgment executed when the city falls, culminating in the execution of key leaders, Sariah the chief priest, Zephaniah the second priest, and 60 leading citizens at Riblah for their rebellion.
Yet amidst this total disaster, the Lord separates the people into the famous metaphor of the good figs and the bad figs, and he makes a stunning declaration about the future of Israel.
The good figs corresponded to the 597 BC exiles, Jehoiachin, the queen mother, the nobles, the skilled craftsmen. Although they were suffering in exile, the Lord promised to watch over them, eventually return them to the promised land, and crucially, give them the desire to acknowledge that I am the Lord.
That's a monumental promise.
It is. It suggests that the future internal spiritual transformation required for the covenant lay with this displaced group.
And conversely, the bad figs.
They included Zedekiah, his administrators, the people who had remained in Jerusalem, and those Judeans who had fled to Egypt for safety. The Lord declared that they would become an object of terror, ridicule, and a curse wherever they were banished, because they resisted repentance until the very end.
So the sources are crystal clear on this.
Very clear. The preservation of the covenant promise lay with the exiles in Babylon, who were now being humbled, not with the obstinate remnant in Judah or Egypt.
We do see a small symbolic sign of future hope with the fate of King Jehoiachin, the good fig king who was exiled in 597 BC.
Yes, after 37 years suffering in a Babylonian prison, evil Merodach Nebuchadnezzar's son and successor pardoned him in 561 BC. He gave Jehoiachin a more prestigious position than the other captive kings, provided him with new robes, and gave him daily provisions until his death.
It wasn't the full restoration, but it was something.
It was not the full Davidic restoration, but it was a clear sign that God's covenant promises were still alive and applicable. The royal line was preserved, and a descendant of David was receiving favor, pointing toward the ultimate fulfillment of the Davidic covenant.
But in the land itself, the immediate aftermath of the 586 BC destruction was just chaos. And it centered around the appointed governor, Gedaliah.
Gedaliah was a favored Judean, appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to govern the remaining poor remnant in Mizpah. He was meant to be the liaison with Babylon and lead the people back into stability and agriculture.
He was their best hope.
He was. He wisely counseled the remaining army officers to submit to Babylon and settle down. He represented the best hope for immediate, albeit subservient, reconstruction.
But the remnants couldn't even manage that peace.
No. Ishmael, a Jewish nationalist and a member of the royal family who clung to the idea of complete political independence, assassinated Gedaliah within the year. This act was treason against both Babylon and the appointed governor, destroying the last vestige of political stability.
That assassination triggered a panic among the remaining Judeans, who feared, rightly, that Babylon would exact a terrible revenge for killing their governor.
The remnant decided to flee to Egypt, taking Jeremiah with them against his desperate, repeated warnings. This was explicitly against the will of God, who had commanded them to remain in the land, promising them peace there if they submitted.
They chose what looked like safety over obedience.
They did.
And the final tragic irony unfolds in Egypt. Settling in places like Migdol, Tahpanhes, and Memphis, the remnant immediately resumed their spiritual adultery, sacrificing openly to the Queen of Heaven.
They were utterly resistant to correction. They even argued that they had prospered while practicing idolatry, failing to acknowledge that their current calamities were Yahweh's punishment for that very practice. They had learned absolutely nothing from the fall of Jerusalem.
And the judgment followed them there, confirming the ultimate fate of the bad figs.
The Lord declared that the entire Judean remnant in Egypt would be destroyed by war, starvation, and disease, just as he had punished Jerusalem. Only a very few fugitives would escape. This final, tragic episode repeatedly emphasizes the core message. Israel's covenant future lay not with those who stubbornly fled to Egypt clinging to idolatry, but with the exiles who were humbled in Babylon, ready for the promised internal change.
Moving to a broader scope, Jeremiah's work expands dramatically to confirm that Judah's judgment wasn't just some random political incident, it was part of a sweeping act of divine sovereignty over the whole world.
This is detailed in the Oracles Against the Nations, or OAN.
And the OAN are critical, aren't they?
They're critical because they demonstrate that Yahweh is not just the God of Israel, but the sovereign ruler of all nations. These prophecies served three main purposes for the surviving community: to pronounce doom on the foreign nations who had oppressed Judah, to offer encouragement that Israel was not judged alone, and to severely warn Israel against depending on foreign alliances like Egypt for security.
So the message is that God is in control of everything.
The overarching message is that the geopolitical events of the 7th and 6th centuries BC were all orchestrated by the Lord.
And the most potent imagery confirming this total sovereignty is that terrifying vision of the cup of Yahweh's wrath.
It's a powerful metaphor for universal judgment. Jeremiah saw himself distributing a literal cup filled with the intoxicating, paralyzing wine of God's wrath to all nations. Drinking this cup meant they would stagger, reel, and suffer from war and devastation.
And significantly, the sources note that Jerusalem and the cities of Judah had to drink it first. Why was that essential?
Because judgment begins with the house of God. Judah's spiritual failure was greater precisely because they had the covenant, the law, and the prophets, yet they rejected them. Once Judah drank, the cup was then extended to Pharaoh of Egypt, to Philistia, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, Sidon, and to all the distant kingdoms of the earth.
So no one was exempt.
No nation, no matter how powerful or secluded, was exempt from the consequences of divine judgment. The message was clear. No one can hide from Yahweh's sovereign will.
But the very executioner, Babylon, was also on the list. Despite being God's temporary servant and war club used to smash other nations, Babylon was doubly rebellious.
Due to her profound idolatry and arrogant pride in her own power, Babylon had made the whole world drunk on the wine of her tyranny, but now she would have to drink from the same cup of God's wrath.
And this is where we get that explicit foundational prophecy about the length of the captivity.
Exactly. The whole area, including the nations mentioned, would be subject to the king of Babylon for precisely 70 years.
That 70-year prophecy is incredibly specific. What was its significance, particularly related to the covenant law?
It connects directly back to the spiritual failure we talked about, specifically the Sabbath. According to the Mosaic covenant, the land was supposed to receive a rest every 7 years, a sabbatical year, where no farming took place.
And they hadn't been doing that.
Historical context suggests that for centuries, the Israelites had failed to keep these land Sabbaths. The sources imply the 70 years of exile restored that rest to the land because the Israelites had neglected 70 sabbatical years. The land would finally enjoy its Sabbaths while the people were gone.
So the exile was not just punishment. It was a corrective measure rooted in covenant law. And the promise for Babylon itself was far more permanent than a mere regime change.
Indeed, after those 70 years were completed, Babylon would be punished for its sins and made an everlasting ruin. This prediction of total desolation goes beyond the historical events of 539 BC, when the Medes and Persians took the city but left it relatively intact.
The sources foretell something much bigger.
A future complete destruction, a time when Babylon becomes a desolate wasteland inhabited only by wild animals, its stones so scattered they cannot even be used to build other nations. It speaks of a final, complete judgment for its oppression and hubris.
And this total collapse was sealed with a powerful, dramatic, symbolic act performed by Jeremiah.
Jeremiah commanded his quartermaster, Seraiah, to read the prophecies against Babylon publicly in the presence of the exiles. Then, in front of witnesses, he was to tie a heavy stone to the scroll containing those prophecies and throw it directly into the mighty Euphrates River.
What did that signify?
The action signified that in the same way the scroll sank and vanished, Babylon would sink and never rise again because of the disaster God was determined to bring upon her. This is the stunning paradox of Jeremiah's ministry. At the very time he was advising his kings to submit to Babylon, he was also foretelling her final, absolute overthrow.
Jeremiah's book does not end in judgment, mud, or despair. Despite the certainty of judgment and the depth of Judah's spiritual failure, Section 6 offers the ultimate pivot, the everlasting promise of restoration. This is often called the Book of Consolation.
This is the hope that sustains the exiles. The restoration is promised to be so great, it's referred to as a second Exodus.
The second exit.
One that will so completely overshadow the original deliverance from Egypt that in the future, people will no longer swear oaths by the God who brought them out of Egypt, but by the God who brought them out of the land of the North Babylon and all the other lands where they had been driven.
The sources detail an absolute promise. The Lord will regather the scattered people from all countries, increase their numbers exponentially, and restore the ruined houses and cities, even those fortified dwellings that had been burned down for their Sabbath breaking.
But this restoration is tied to something deeper than just geography.
It's tied to an internal transformation.
And a necessary shift in accountability. The Lord promises a future where people would no longer be able to use the ancient proverb, "The parents have eaten sour grapes, but the children's teeth have grown numb."
What was the implication of that proverb? What did it mean?
It was a way for people to blame the historical sins of their forefathers for their own plight. It was a way of denying their own moral agency. By abolishing this proverb, the Lord is enforcing a new principle of strict, immediate, individual responsibility.
So no more excuses.
Everyone would bear the consequences of his own sin. This confirms that justice would be manifestly obvious and personal in that day. It prepares them for a time when the individual heart matters more than corporate solidarity in sin.
And this spiritual restoration is tied to the promise of the righteous branch, a messianic figure who will bring this justice.
Yes, the fulfillment of the long-standing Davidic covenant. God promised to raise up a righteous branch, a descendant of David, who would rule wisely, justly, and righteously. This is in stark contrast to the corrupt puppet kings like Jehoiakim and Zedekiah who scattered and destroyed the flock.
So this future king would be a true shepherd.
A true shepherd, leading the people into a state of perpetual righteousness and peace.
The absolute peak of this prophetic vision, and perhaps the most important concept in the sources we studied, is the everlasting new covenant. This promise addresses the fundamental, unchangeable inability of the people to obey God under the old system.
That's right. We established earlier that the problem wasn't the law itself. The Mosaic law was perfect. The problem was the human heart, which Jeremiah earlier described as more deceitful than anything else and incurably bad.
So the old system couldn't fix that.
Under the Mosaic covenant, the law was written externally on stone tablets, requiring perfect human obedience. Under the new covenant, the Lord promised to do something for them they could not do for themselves.
And what exactly does that internal divine action entail?
The law will be written on their heart.
On their heart.
Meaning on their very mind and will. This provides a new internal motivation and enablement, fostering obedience and preventing sin because the inclination to disobey is removed. This new covenant would be everlasting, unbreakable, and profound.
So, if the law is written on the heart, what does that mean for their relationship with God?
It reestablishes the intimate covenant relationship that was shattered by Judah's spiritual adultery and sin. The Lord promises to grant them one heart, a single-minded purpose, to perpetually fear and reverence God. The profound shift is that God promises to give them a faithful heart, so they will finally, perpetually, and voluntarily revere him.
So they won't stray again.
They will no longer stray from him, which guarantees blessing for them and their descendants. It's a transition from external compulsion to internal desire.
So what does this all mean? We've traced the narrative arc from the tragic political collapse beginning with Josiah through the agonizing reigns of the puppet kings and analyzed the devastating spiritual failure rooted in idolatry, social injustice, and hypocrisy.
We've witnessed the absolute certainty of Babylonian judgment over Judah and the nations.
But we finish with the ultimate prophetic victory promised for the future, a righteous branch and an everlasting new covenant written on the heart.
The deepest challenge for Judah was their moral blindness. They failed to listen to the prophets. They confused the ancient ways of righteousness with obsolete ways, choosing instead to rely on human cunning, political maneuvering, and military alliances.
And the sources prove repeatedly that dependence on mere flesh and blood results in a curse.
A dry, unproductive, lonely existence. Trust in the Lord, conversely, yields blessing and strength, like a tree planted near a stream, constantly bearing fruit even when drought comes.
Judah's fate was sealed by the self-deception that they could sin habitually and still remain safe, either by running to the temple or by fleeing to Egypt. They rationalized their evil, they ignored the warnings, they even tried to burn the written word of the Lord.
They acted as if God was only present in Jerusalem, and once they fled, they were safe from his view.
The ultimate question raised by Jeremiah's deep dive is tied directly to God's nature and the nature of our own inner lives. The Lord reminds us, "Do you really think anyone can hide himself where I cannot see him? Do you not know that I am everywhere?"
The knowledge that the human heart is incurably bad stands in direct tension with God's inescapable, all-perceiving presence, which examines not just our visible actions, but the hidden inclinations and resolutions of our will. The question for you to mull over, building on the profound insight of the New Covenant, is this. If the Lord is everywhere seeing and examining our minds and hearts, how should that inescapable presence transform not just our visible conduct, but the hidden internal reality of our motivations, which were once the reason for Judah's fall?